I never expected a single text message to change the way I saw my own family, but the moment it lit up my screen, something inside me shifted. It was supposed to be a simple day, my son's birthday, a moment of joy I had carefully prepared for, hoping to make up for all the challenges we'd faced recently. But instead of love or support, I was met with an excuse wrapped in pity, a claim that things were tight, and that they wouldn't be coming. At first, I brushed it off, telling myself it wasn't worth getting upset over. Life is unpredictable. People struggle. I convinced myself to stay calm, to focus on my son's smile, and ignore the sting in my chest. But as the hours passed and the truth began to unravel piece by piece, I realized that nothing about their decision had to do with money at all. The lie was far bigger, far colder, and far more deliberate than I could have imagined. It wasn't just about skipping a child's birthday. It was about who they really were when they thought I wasn't watching. And in that moment, standing in the middle of a half-decorated living room, holding a piece of a story that didn't yet make sense, I made a quiet promise to myself. If they wanted to play cruel games behind my back, they were about to learn what happens when I stop playing nice. The only question was, how far was I willing to go? Before everything unraveled, my life felt like a careful balance I had finally learned to maintain. As a single mother, I had grown used to juggling more roles than anyone around me seemed to notice: provider, planner, emotional anchor, and the quiet force holding everything together. My days started early, long before the sun reached through my kitchen window, and ended late, usually with me collapsing onto the couch after putting my son to bed, scrolling through my phone in those few moments of stillness that felt like borrowed time. Despite the exhaustion, there was comfort in the routine. I worked part-time at a small local clinic, a job that wasn't glamorous but offered stability. My coworkers often joked that I carried the whole place with my smile alone, even on the days when I felt like I was stitching myself together just to make it through. My son, my bright, curious, stubborn little boy, was the center of my world. Every decision I made, every sacrifice, every late-night worry revolved around giving him a life where he felt safe, loved, and never like an afterthought. My family, at least in theory, was supposed to be my support system. I grew up believing that no matter how messy life got, they would be there, ready to sweep up the broken pieces and help me rebuild. And for a long time, I held on to that belief like it was a lifeline. Even when their actions didn't always match their words, I told myself it was just who they were: busy, distracted, sometimes inconsiderate, but still family. Still the people I could rely on when it truly mattered. There were signs, of course. Small moments I dismissed, because acknowledging them felt like admitting some deeper truth I wasn't ready to confront. The comments about how independent I was, said with a hint of distance. The way they seemed to smile tighter when I talked about something good happening in my life. The excuses that became more frequent whenever I needed something simple: help watching my son for an hour, a ride when my car broke down, even just a moment of presence during holidays. None of it seemed malicious at the time. Just inconvenient. Just disappointing. But disappointment was easier to swallow than the possibility of intentional neglect. So I swallowed it, again and again, telling myself that maybe I expected too much, or maybe I was just sensitive or overwhelmed. It was easier to focus on what I could control: my home, my job, my son's happiness, the little celebrations I planned for him to make sure he always felt valued. His birthday was one of those things. I had been planning it for weeks, choosing his favorite theme, saving bit by bit to make it special, imagining the look on his face when he saw the decorations and cake. In the midst of that preparation, life felt normal, stable, predictable. I laughed more. I breathed a little easier. I let myself believe that maybe things were shifting in a good direction, that my hard work was finally paying off, and that even if my family wasn't perfect, they still cared enough to show up for the moments that mattered. But beneath that small bubble of hope, an uneasiness lingered, one I kept pushing aside. A quiet feeling that something wasn't adding up. The way certain conversations with my family felt shorter, more clipped. The strange pauses when I mentioned the party. The feeling that I was being handled rather than heard. I chalked it up to stress, to everyone living their own lives. But in hindsight, That subtle distance was the first crack in the picture-perfect version of my family I had held on to. Still, I didn't dwell on it. I had too much to do, too much on my plate to indulge in suspicion. So I focused on my son's big day, telling myself everything would fall into place. That they would show up like they always had, maybe imperfectly, maybe inconsistently, but still present. I didn't know it then, but the truth was already unfolding behind the scenes. A truth that would shatter every assumption I had about the people I trusted. A truth that would lead me down a path of hurt, revelation, and ultimately, a quiet but calculated revenge. And all it took to set that path into motion was a single text message, one that would reveal far more than it intended. The morning of my son's birthday started like any other, but there was a tension under my skin I couldn't name. I woke up early, long before my alarm, and stared at the ceiling while the house remained silent. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe that the day would be simple, joyful even. I moved through the motions, preparing breakfast, decorating the living room, and feeling that familiar blend of exhaustion and excitement that comes with wanting everything to be perfect for someone you love. My son's laughter filled the space as he played with the balloons I'd blown up the night before, completely unaware of the storm that was about to break over us. I kept glancing at my phone throughout the morning, waiting for a message from my family, expecting a confirmation or at least a hint of enthusiasm. Nothing came, but I tried not to let it bother me. I reminded myself that they often ran late, often forgot, and often acted like they lived in their own world. I convinced myself they were probably on their way or would text soon. That hope, fragile, desperate, naive, held me together for a few hours. Then the text arrived. A short message claiming life was tight, money was tight. Everything was suddenly too tight for them to show up. A small excuse, almost dismissive, like my son's birthday was some optional task they couldn't be bothered with. For a moment, I just stared at the words, feeling an ache spread through my chest. I told myself it didn't matter, that we would celebrate on our own, but something about the timing, the phrasing, the coldness behind the message felt wrong. Still, I brushed it aside because I had to stay strong for him. But the truth has a strange way of revealing itself when you least expect it. Later that afternoon, after I'd cleaned up the remains of the small party we had managed between just the two of us, I stepped outside to take out the trash. The weather was cool, the kind of quiet that makes the world feel paused. As I walked past the gate, I noticed movement at the far end of the street, familiar silhouettes, familiar voices, and a burst of loud laughter. I didn't recognize it at first, but curiosity made me slow down. That curiosity turned into confusion, and then into something far sharper. It was them. My family. The ones who couldn't come because money was tight. They weren't heading to work or running errands. They were dressed up, walking toward a neighbor's house, someone I barely knew but had seen them talking to a few times. My heart sank as the realization hit. They had chosen to attend someone else's event instead of their own grandson's birthday. An event they didn't even bother to mention. An event they clearly valued more than us. I froze, letting the pieces fall into place one by one. The clipped conversations. The strange pauses. The distance I sensed in the weeks leading up to the party. It all made sense now. They hadn't been struggling. They hadn't been overwhelmed. They simply didn't care enough to show up. Worse, they didn't want to. They made a choice, a deliberate one, masked with a flimsy excuse they assumed I'd accept without question. A sour mix of anger and disbelief rushed through me, so strong it felt like a physical force. For a moment, I stood rooted to the ground, unable to move as I watched them laugh, smile, and blend into a celebration I wasn't invited to, one they prioritized over their own blood. A quiet betrayal, disguised as casual convenience. I walked back inside with a heaviness spreading from my chest to my stomach. My son met me with a grin, holding one of his toys up proudly, completely unaware of the hurt brewing inside me. I forced a smile, but the moment he turned away, my facade cracked. The loneliness hit me all at once, like every sacrifice I had ever made as a mother was suddenly piling onto my shoulders. I replayed their message in my mind over and over, each time feeling a part of my faith in them crumble a little more. I tried to rationalize it, to find excuses the way I always had, but something in me refused to bend this time. I had given them every benefit of the doubt, every chance to show they cared, and they still managed to remind me where I stood, somewhere below their convenience, below their comfort, below their image. That night, after putting my son to bed, I sat alone on the couch, letting the silence wrap around me. But instead of breaking down, something else rose to the surface: clarity. A cold, sharp clarity that cut through the last bits of hope I had held on to. Their betrayal wasn't just about a missed birthday. It was about years of neglect, subtle dismissals, and emotional distance they expected me to accept without question. They thought I would keep swallowing their excuses, keep forgiving, keep bending until I snapped. But they were wrong. I decided I wouldn't confront them. Not yet. Confrontation would only give them room to lie, to twist the narrative, to paint themselves as victims. Instead, I wanted something different. Something that would show them I understood exactly who they were. Something that would expose the truth without me needing to utter a single word. Revenge, I realized, doesn't always start with anger. Sometimes it starts with silence, the kind that makes the guilty uncomfortable, the kind that forces them to watch their own actions unravel. So I sat there in that dim room, slowly piecing together a plan. A quiet one, a clever one, a plan that would make them feel the sting of exclusion, the cold edge of being overlooked, the weight of being treated like an afterthought. But as I mapped out my steps in my mind, something else happened. Something unexpected. Messages began to trickle in the following days. No apologies. No explanations. Just casual, empty check-ins, the kind that pretended everything was fine. The kind that expected me to act like nothing had happened. It was almost insulting. They didn't even realize the damage they'd done, or maybe they thought I was too fragile to call it out. Their obliviousness only fueled my resolve. I knew then that I needed to do more than simply distance myself. I needed to show them the consequences of their choices. Not through confrontation, but through a shift so subtle, so calculated, that they wouldn't notice it until it was too late. And just when I thought my plan was forming clearly, the situation took a darker turn. Because as I began paying closer attention, I discovered something far worse. Something that made their absence on my son's birthday feel like only a small piece of a larger betrayal. Something that involved not just neglect, but manipulation. Something that made me question every memory I had of them in the past year. I wasn't just dealing with selfishness. I was dealing with deception. And that discovery became the fuel for something much bigger than simple revenge. It became the reason I refused to hold back anymore. Because once the full truth came out, there was no returning to the person I had been before. And they were about to learn exactly what that meant. The moment everything shifted didn't arrive with noise or chaos. It came quietly, almost too quietly, slipping into my life like the final piece of a puzzle falling into place. I had spent weeks observing them from a distance, letting their inconsistencies speak louder than their empty check-ins. Each evasive answer, each suspicious outing, each moment they pretended everything was normal only sharpened my focus. I learned to read between their lines, to follow the patterns they thought were invisible. And when the truth finally revealed itself, it felt like the snap of a cord pulled too tightly for too long. They hadn't simply skipped my son's birthday. They had been actively pushing me out, slowly removing themselves from my life, while still clinging to the benefits of being seen as family. They had been attending gatherings, events, and celebrations with people who barely knew them, while quietly avoiding their own blood. They had spun a narrative behind my back, painting me as fragile, dramatic, overwhelmed, and too independent to need them. A story designed to justify their absence before I even realized what they were doing. And then came the final blow. I discovered that they hadn't just attended the neighbor's celebration, they had helped plan it. They had contributed money, time, and effort towards someone else's event, all while claiming they couldn't afford to show up for their own grandson. It felt deliberate, calculated. And when I learned that they had been joking about the whole situation, brushing off my son's birthday as small, as not worth the hassle, something in me hardened beyond repair. My revenge stopped being an idea. It became a decision. I didn't want chaos or confrontation. I didn't want screaming or accusations. I wanted precision. I wanted them to feel what they had made me feel. Small, ignored, unimportant, and painfully alone. But I also wanted something deeper, accountability. Not the kind that comes from calling someone out, but the kind that comes from letting the truth reveal itself in a way no one can hide from. So, I created an opportunity. For weeks, I acted as though nothing had happened. I responded to their messages politely, kept my distance emotionally, and waited. I waited until the moment I knew they would want something from me, validation, presence, or the appearance of a normal relationship they could parade in front of others. That moment came sooner than I expected. They were hosting a family gathering, something public enough that they wanted everyone to think we were close. They assumed I would come, as I always had. They assumed I would show up smiling, ready to support them, eager to belong. They assumed wrong. The morning of the event, I woke with a calmness that felt foreign. It wasn't peace. It was for a purpose. I got ready not to attend their gathering, but to expose their truth in a way that required no confrontation at all. I collected the pieces I had gathered, the photos, the posts, the screenshots, the whispered comments they didn't know had reached me. I organized them into something simple, yet undeniable, a timeline of their choices, laid out clearly and without embellishment. I didn't need to accuse them. I didn't need to explain. I just needed them to see themselves as I finally saw them. Then came the final step, sharing it. Not with strangers. Not with the world. But with the people who mattered most in their orbit, the ones they tried to impress, the ones they bragged to about being family-oriented, the ones they wanted to maintain an image for. I didn't add commentary or bitterness. I simply shared the truth with the quiet precision of someone who no longer needed to shout to be heard. When they arrived at their event, expecting admiration and applause, they instead walked into a room rippling with whispers. People who once looked at them with admiration now looked at them with confusion, disappointment, even pity. Not because I painted them as villains, but because their own behavior had done that for me. I wasn't there to witness it, but I didn't need to be. The messages started arriving almost immediately. Some confused, some defensive, some frantic. They wanted explanations. They wanted reassurance. They wanted the chance to control the narrative the way they always had. But for the first time in my life, I didn't give it to them. Instead, I took my son to the park, a simple outing, just the two of us. The sun was warm, the air calm, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to freedom. I watched him laugh, run, and play without a care in the world. And in that moment, I understood the truth I should have seen long ago. I didn't need them. Not their validation. Not their presence. Not their conditional love. Hours later, when my phone buzzed again, I knew it wasn't going to stop. They had realized what it felt like to be excluded, to be ignored, to be left out of something they assumed they had a right to. They were experiencing the very pain they caused me, but this time they couldn't hide behind excuses or lies. Their own actions had finally caught up to them, and I felt no guilt, only clarity, because this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming the space they had taken for granted. It was about teaching them the lesson they never thought they needed to learn. It was about showing them that I wasn't the fragile, forgiving person they assumed I would always be. As the sun began to set, I watched my son chase fireflies in the golden light, his laughter echoing through the air. And in that peaceful moment, I understood something even deeper. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's choosing yourself so completely that those who underestimated you are forced to confront the emptiness left behind. But even then, I knew my story wasn't over. Because their reaction to my silence was about to reveal something I never expected, something that would change everything yet again. And I wasn't prepared for what came next. In the days that followed, the silence between my family and me grew thicker, heavier, almost tangible. It was no longer the careless silence they had once offered, the kind that came from indifference or neglect. This silence was different. It was the silence of consequence, the lingering echo of their own actions catching up to them in a way they never expected. And for the first time in my adult life, I didn't feel the need to chase their validation or soften the discomfort. I simply let the silence exist, and I existed comfortably inside it. The fallout from the event spread quickly. People who once saw my family as warm and dependable began to see the cracks they had worked so hard to hide. Friends, neighbors, and acquaintances who had watched them flaunt their image of togetherness now whispered questions they couldn't answer. They tried to regain control of the narrative, painting the situation as a misunderstanding, but the truth was already out. And the truth, once revealed, doesn't return to the shadows easily. Surprisingly, their reaction wasn't anger, it was fear. Fear of losing their image. Fear of being seen for who they truly were. Fear of the consequences they had never imagined would come from something they thought was so small. They reached out more than ever, suddenly eager to explain, to reconnect, to pretend they had never meant any harm. Their messages arrived in long bursts, filled with emotional appeals, excuses disguised as reasoning, and attempts to pull me back into the role they were comfortable giving me. The forgiving one, the one who kept the peace, the one who swallowed hurt quietly. But I didn't respond. Not because I wanted to hurt them further, but because I finally understood that peace built on my silence was not peace at all. It was compliance. And I had spent years complying out of habit, out of fear, out of a desperate desire to belong to something that had never truly included me. As the days passed, the weight I carried for so long began to lift. It didn't happen all at once. It came in small moments, folding my son's clothes, cooking dinner, watching a movie with him on the couch, moments where I realized I no longer felt the heavy tug of disappointment or the constant ache of trying to prove my worth. I felt lighter, clearer, stronger. My revenge hadn't been loud or messy. It hadn't come with shouting or tears or dramatic confrontations. It had been quiet, intentional, and rooted in truth. And in that quiet clarity, something unexpected happened. I began to heal. Not because they suffered, not because they were exposed, but because for the first time I chose myself without apology. My relationship with my family didn't end in a single moment. It faded, slowly, naturally, like a photograph left too long in the sun. They continued reaching out for a while, each message becoming shorter and less desperate than the last. Eventually, the messages stopped altogether. The silence returned, but this time, it wasn't heavy. It was peaceful. With distance, I began to see my life differently. I stopped measuring my worth through their approval. I stopped reliving the pain of being overlooked. I stopped carrying the burden of making them better people than they chose to be. And in that newfound freedom, I realized something important. Revenge isn't always about destruction. Sometimes, it's about reclaiming space, reclaiming voice, reclaiming power. My revenge didn't ruin them. It revealed them. And that was enough. The real impact, though, came in how I moved forward. I became more intentional about the people I allowed into my life. I built boundaries not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect. I stopped assuming that blood ties were synonymous with loyalty. I learned that family can be chosen as much as it can be inherited. And slowly, I created a life where my son and I were surrounded by people who didn't just show up when it was easy, but who showed up because it mattered. Looking back, I sometimes wonder if things could have been different, if there was a version of events where I confronted them directly or gave them a chance to explain. But every time I revisit that question, I come back to the same realization. They had countless chances to show love, respect, or accountability. They chose not to. And when people show you who they truly are, the most powerful thing you can do is believe them. My story isn't just about a skipped birthday. It's about years of minimization, neglect, and emotional abandonment. It's about finally recognizing that forgiveness without accountability becomes self-inflicted pain. It's about understanding that choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's survival. And now, when I look at my life, I don't see a void where my family once stood. I see space. Space for people who genuinely care, space for peace that isn't performative, space for the kind of love that doesn't require me to shrink to fit someone else's comfort. If there's one thing I hope this story leaves you with, it's this. Sometimes the first step toward healing is the courage to stop waiting for people to be who they never were. Sometimes revenge is simply refusing to accept less than you deserve. And sometimes the most powerful justice comes from walking away and letting the truth speak for itself. So I'll leave you with a question, one that changed everything for me. When someone shows you their true priorities, how long will you keep pretending they're lying?